Previously on Gearz.
Well, there we go. Some of the quotes and voice, quite eerie to hear them as well, of the late, great Ayrton Senna. And that's what we're going to be focusing on, as mentioned. 18 years ago, yesterday, was the anniversary of the death of Ayrton Senna. Joining me on Gearz for the first time, first ever interviews that we're having with guests. We've got Absolute F1 team, Gary Formato, Vic Maharaj. And a man I think over the years that I've got to know, and I know he has a tremendous passion for Ayrton Senna and also has an incredible knowledge, Egmont Sippel. I'm going to start with you, Egmont. 18 years ago yesterday, did you do anything to remember?
Sasha, it's obviously you think back on that day, you go through the whole day again, you wonder why it had to happen. Each year it's the same. You always, that question will always be there. Why did it have to go off? Why him? Why did that suspension arm break off in that particular way to penetrate his helmet? Because his body was, he didn't have injuries on his body.
Yeah, incredible.
At all. So, and he would have survived like Nelson Piquet survived in '86. It was, in a sense, it looked horrendous, like you said. But in a sense, it should have been an innocuous little accident. Because the cars at that point, safety has advanced a lot, but already at that point the cars were very strong and protecting the drivers very well. And he was just unlucky that suspension arm penetrated his helmet in that exact little gap between the visor and the helmet, and it hit him at exactly that angle that it would penetrate and not deflect.
Yeah, it's actually mind-boggling because, over the years, since that accident, there were court cases and everybody has an opinion as to what happened, why it happened, was it a manufacturing fault? Gary, when you look back and you look at that accident, and I remember watching it on TV, and you said and went, gee, Senna's had an big crash, but you didn't think that it was going to be a fatal crash.
No, not at all. As F1 said, Nelson Piquet crashed heavily the year, walked away from it, Michele Alboreto. The arrows crashed heavily there, and it was, as you said, Senna's going to get up and get out the car, and in fact there was a bit of movement, but we didn't know at the time that he was actually, unfortunately passed on already. So it was unbelievable, and obviously, when Senna crashed like that, the thing that at that time, how could it happen to Ayrton Senna?
Exactly,
and that even now, talking about today, you get goosebumps just thinking that, saying, how could it happen to Senna? And speaking to my father and old people, they say this felt the same way when Jimmy Clark was killed at Hockenheim. Said, how could it happen to somebody so good? And that is what really stood out for me at that particular moment.
It's just quite incredible. 18 years, and yesterday, just watching on social media, Facebook, Twitter, the amount of memories that people were displaying of what they remember about Senna. Yes, we've started off, unfortunately, with a tragic death. But Vic, memories of Ayrton Senna, he in a way revolutionized Formula One with his fitness kind of regime, the way that he looked at the sport in a completely different way as opposed to people in let's say, the late 70s. But what Senna brought to Formula One, you also got to sit there and say, unfortunately, through his death, actually propelled Formula One into a really mega sport.
Yeah, absolutely, Sasha. And I think overall what a lot of people don't realize is what we actually lost. Probably the greatest racing driver of all time, 41 race wins, 65 pole positions, which was only bettered just recently, about 5-6 years ago, by the great Michael Schumacher. But overall, you've got to say that he brought together professionalism, he brought together fitness, he was able to negotiate very hard deals with Ron Dennis, and we know that Ron isn't the easiest of guys to actually get deals struck out of. He was a fantastic ambassador for Formula One. He always says those famous words, racing is in my blood. And if you remember, I think that particular lap, him and Prost were going at it through the streets, and he was just able to find half a second and another half a second, and he always finds it within himself. It's not so much adjusting the car, it's adjusting the person. And in the end, he was driving outside his body, the way he was saying it. He just leads you to believe he was just surreal in his ability, in his what he was able to extract out of a Formula One car. And the world is slightly cheated to have lost out on a bit of Ayrton Senna.
Yeah, that's for sure. Egmont, if you look at him as a man, you get modern-day Formula One drivers who toe the corporate line, don't really say much, besides maybe a Kimi Räikkönen. It's so refreshing to have him back, because at least you got somebody who, is a little bit edgier.
Yeah.
But Senna wore his heart in his sleeve. I mean, he spoke what he wanted to when he had altercations, and we'll get into some of those altercations a little bit later. But he was an incredibly spiritual kind of a person, which is quite uncanny to have, for somebody in such a high-risk sport.
Senna was, in a sense, it's always a dangerous thing to say, but in a sense, he was bigger than the sport itself. You get it now and again. Get it in boxing with Muhammad Ali.
Mm-hmm.
Ali was, in a sense, bigger than boxing. Senna was, in a sense, bigger than racing. And because of that stature that he had, and that presence that he had, and the personality and the charisma that he had, and the following that he had right across this globe, he was in a position to speak his mind. But, he didn't attain that sort of stature and then decided to speak his mind. He spoke his mind right from the beginning. That was the type of character he was. And he had respect of the world for that, I think, for being the man that he was, not only the driver that he was.
Yeah, an incredibly generous man as well. I mean, Gary came from very, very wealthy upbringing, went to go and race in Europe, but it was amazing. Brazil was his life, and yes, of course he was Brazilian, but he gave so much back, with the foundations, the trust that he created while he was still racing. An incredibly selfless kind of a man, but put him on a racetrack and an incredibly selfish kind of a man.
Yeah, exactly that, and I think also instilled a sense of pride in Brazil at that point in time. Something that we hadn't seen in the motor racing world, in particular Formula One, and it wasn't something that we all knew about it at that stage. Just as to what lengths Senna was going to in his home country to do the sort of work that he was doing. We saw him as Senna, the racing driver, and I've got to be totally honest. I wasn't a Senna fan at that point in time in my life. I thought he was arrogant. I thought, who is this guy? Is he crazy? You know what I mean? Saying the things that he's saying, as Egmont is saying, talking about the spiritual happenings that he, believed it went on when he was in a car. I mean, and you believed at that point in time he was doing that to outcycle all his components. I mean, that's really what it was about. And subsequently, having seen what we see now and the movie and other things we've heard and read about Senna, yes, there was a very different side to Senna. But I think that's what made him so unique. There were two very, very different sides to Ayrton Senna, the man.
I mean, it is. There were. But I want to go back to, I suppose, the first time I ever saw him. And I think, for a lot of people, he was driving a Tolman. I think it was 84 in the rain at Monaco. Prost was in the lead, and you had this guy in a car that, I don't know, looked like a bus. His head was bobbing out of the top, and he was putting in laps, Egmont, that no one could even think about doing in that kind of weather. Yeah. And that's what created all of a sudden, Ayrton Senna was, oh my word, we've got a superstar. No one would have known what it was going to actually lead to.
No. Senna started that race in 13th. And he was driving the Stolman Hart with this
which is Rory Byrne design, by the way.
Yes, yeah. But it was a crude car, and it was an even cruder engine. It was the Hart turbo, and it just came in with a bang. There was a lot of lag, and then suddenly all the power arrived at once. And Gary would tell you more than any of us could how difficult that must be to drive on a wet track like that, on a street circuit as well. And the guy was just mesmerizing. He picked off the first 12 guys, and Mansell and Rosberg and Prost and the whole lot. And he passed Prost on the 31st lap, I think it was, and then on the 32nd lap.
Yeah.
And then Jackie X stopped the race and they back counted.
Back counted by one lap, yeah.
By one lap, and Prost was still in the lead if you'd subtracted that lap, and so Prost won. Senna was thoroughly angry about that because he really deserved the victory. I mean, he was catching Prost by like 2 seconds a lap at one point.
In such an inferior car.
Yeah,
I mean, it was an extraordinary race, and if you've never seen that race, it is definitely something. YouTube, you'll pick it up. You'll find some of those clips.
Sasha, sorry if I may interrupt there. Just to make the point about Monaco and how Senna holds the record there. He's got 6 victories there. He's the master of Monaco. And but just to make the point, if you think that he caught Prost only because it was wet and all of that, remember that in '88 when they both drove the same car, both drove for McLaren.
Exactly.
Senna's pole time, if I remember correctly, was 1 minute 23.997. Prost was 1:25.4. So Senna was 1.4 seconds quicker than Prost. And Prost told the story afterwards. He said he was actually quite satisfied with his lap. And Senna was having trouble with his car. The car was, I'm not sure whether it was a bit of a misfire, and he wasn't happy with the car. And then eventually, towards the end of qualifying, Senna went out, and he was happy with the car, and he put in this lap, 1:23.997. And Prost was just devastated because he was happy with his lap. Now, if we say that he caught Prost by 2 seconds a lap on a wet Monaco, we should not make the mistake of thinking it was only because it was wet.
No.
The dry with exactly the same car, exactly the same tyres, he was almost 1.5 seconds quicker than Prost on a qualifier.
On one lap. And I mean, listen, no one will ever forget Gary when he was leading by 52 seconds in Monaco, and stuck it in the wall.
Yeah, was asked to slow down, in fact, by the team. He was so far ahead. They said, take it easy, and he lost a bit of concentration, crashed the car. But, the big thing there was his reaction when he got out the car.
Yeah.
He was so mad and incensed at himself. I mean, the story, walked off to his apartment in Monaco, never spoke to anybody at the team for a couple of hours. I mean, it just tells you this guy wanted to win and prove a point all the time, and in particular at Monaco's, and particularly to beat Prost. That we all know that was his big rival. He wanted to annihilate Prost.
And it's amazing. We'll talk Prost against Senna. And I also want to talk quite a lot about the movie that came out, the documentary Senna that came out, because there have been many since his death. And I think between the three of us, we've seen all of them. But I want to talk specifically about the one that came out last year, which won a couple of awards for the greatest ever documentary. But before we get into that, Vic, you look back at Senna, and I want to get into some of the situations that he put himself in as well. The first one, you got to go back to the 89 season. 88 was just an incredible year for McLaren and for both of them, for both Prost and Senna. But 89, all of a sudden, the friction between the two got to a very, very hectic point, and then you get to Japan at the end of the year, towards the end of the year, and the changing of the grid position from the dirty, as Ayrton always used to call it, the dirty. And it's amazing when we talk on TV, we always talk about the dirty side of the track. And, I always am reminded of Ayrton Senna in Japan going, but I've got pole position, and now you've moved the grid box to the other side, to the dirty side of the track. This was not one of the first, but one of the many incidents he had with, at that stage, Jean-Marie Balestre.
Yeah, well, if you watch the movie as well, we've been talking about, that's really shown up in very great detail and in depth there. Didn't have a particularly great relationship with the FIA president at that stage. And, Senna, he was there to win. It was plain and simple. He didn't want to come P2. He wants to win every race. He wants to be fastest at every single lap, pole position as well. And he felt really hard done by. I think he went and spoke to the stewards beforehand. They did say it was going to be on that particular position. He was satisfied, and then it was changed by Jean-Marie Balestre, which was unfortunate. He was very upset by it. And then you saw the situations that led on to it from that particular start, and also at the end of the day, going into, I think, the chicane after 130R with Prost, that famous maneuver, he went onto the inside. He was substantially faster than Alain Prost at that stage, going for the win. And Prost says he didn't turn in, or Prost did say he turned in because he was taking his line into the corner, but unfortunately Senna was in there. Senna then wanted to win so badly, he stayed in his car, he got the marshals to push start him, came back to the pits, changed his nose cone, still won the race, whereas Alain Prost got out of the car and walked back to the pits and went straight up to the steward's office and was immediately doing whatever Alain Prost does particularly well, and get the FIA around himself to get Ayrton Senna out of the race. That
was the end of 89 when they're both in McLaren. Yeah. But the interesting thing there is, I don't know, Vic, if you've ever seen the helicopter, Gary, maybe you might have seen it as well, Sasha.
Yeah.
The helicopter shot of that specific incident. Correct. It's very revealing, because it is very clear that Prost turned in about 20 yards too soon.
He was way too...
He was not going for the apex at all. He was just gunning for Senna.
He was going for what they call in golf a tiger line.
Yes,
straight over.
That's
now,
a tiger line.
I want to know, Egmont, from you, from all of your research on Senna as well. Did he ever make peace with Balestre?
I'm not sure about Balestre. Senna was not. He made his peace with Prost, as we all know.
Yeah.
And I think that in his mind, Senna was that type of guy that would forgive and forget. So there's nothing on record, as far as I know, that he actually met with Balestre and made his peace with Balestre. But I'm pretty sure that in his mind, as time went by, Senna either did or would have forgiven Balest. He was that type of guy. You know, he was bigger than a little grudge, although those grudges were justified. Just to get back to that incident off the start line in 1990 with Prost.
Yeah.
The thing is not that Balest changed the position. He didn't change it, because they all agreed pole was on the dirty side of the track. And all the drivers and Balest agreed that pole would be switched. But Balest thought, at that point, the Ferrari was quicker than the McLaren. And Balest thought he's safe, because he thought that Prost will get pole.
Yeah.
And therefore, he would then switch it. And then when Senna got pole, he gave the order not to switch. So Senna was still on the inside, still on the dirty line.
That's right.
But the interesting thing about that is, if you analyze it, you can go to the videos. I mean,
easy.
I'm not talking theory here. It's on the videos. Senna, when he went into turn 1, put his car on the inside of Prost, and he actually put his right front wheel on the curb. That is not a line that any driver who is determined to take his opponent out would ever follow. That is the line of a guy who's trying to put his car on the inside line and make it impossible for the other guy to take the correct line. So he didn't go for Prost, as people commonly believe. He tried to force Prost to stay on the outside.
Listen, I think I could agree with that to a point, but I think in his mind also, he sat there and he said, this is now my time, end of story, and whatever it's going to take, it'll take. And you know, unfortunately, it did all happen at the first corner back down in Suzuka in those days. Gary, I want to talk a little bit about Prost himself, because Alain Prost, 4 times world champion, and a lot of people just sit there and go, Senna, Prost, Senna, Prost. Senna was always the better. Prost always was just a grumpy kind of a guy. But Prost also needs a tremendous amount of praise for being the racing driver that he was, and pushing Ayrton Senna to those kind of limits.
Well, exactly. I think took Senna to new heights,
Yeah.
and and that is probably one of the reasons why Senna wanted to go to McLaren, to put himself against Alain Prost, who was the best. I mean, Alain Prost could have been a 6-time world champion easy. He had luck on his way in certain other teams for Renault early on in his career. I mean, you're not a 4-time world championship winner for nothing. And that's what I think gave us one of the most exciting battles between drivers in Formula One at that point in time. Very different driving styles, very different techniques. And I think anybody will come out, even at McLaren, saying, on his day when the car was right, when the professor had everything sorted out, he was quicker than Ayrton Senna. Senna, I think, had the ability to drive the car around a problem much better than Prost. And of course, how often do you get a perfect car in motor racing? Not very often. And I think that was the difference between the two.
Yeah, well, the Senna Prost story is incredibly well documented. Great book that came out a couple of years ago, which I think gave a very, very frank account of the two of them. Let's move on to, as Prost went to Ferrari, as we know, then decided to take a bit of time off, came back with Williams, and Julie won a championship straight after Nigel Mansell had in a much superior car to anything else. And then eventually it came, Egmont, that Senna was now going to leave McLaren, which nobody ever thought was going to happen, but he wanted the best car. And the best car at that stage, everybody thought, was going to be the Williams. And he moved over to Williams, and things didn't quite go as the way that they expected, specifically in the first 2 races.
Yeah, Sasha, they had a lot to do at that point with electronics. And the 93 and 92 Williams was really, really good with ride-out control, active suspension.
ABS brakes.
So when all of that was banned, Williams suddenly found themselves in beginning of 94 with a totally unbalanced car. Very difficult car to drive. And the car would switch from understeer to oversteer in the blink of an eye. And both Senna and Damon Hill had a lot of problems with that car, controlling that car. If you remember at Aida, where they had the Japanese Grand Prix, or Pacific Grand Prix actually, both of them in practice spun that car at precisely the same point, which shows you that there was something inherent in that car that was unpredictable. It was a really difficult car to drive, even at Imola, where Senna then eventually crashed in practice. Senna spun the car coming out of Tosa, and it was within the blink of an eye. And that was the problem. The car was totally unbalanced. They had to work on. Patrick Head was caught out a little bit by the absence of all these electronics. They had obviously designed a car that depended so heavily on electronics the previous 2 seasons that it was difficult for Patrick to get straight into a car without all of that, and hence they ended up with this extremely difficult car to drive. And then, of course, in the race itself, or before the race, Senna asked for a change in steering column, and the weld was not done well enough. And that's where the column broke and the car steered off the road.
It was very, very tragic and unfortunate. We're going to talk about that weekend, but let's. The announcement of Ayrton Senna's death was one of the biggest sporting, unfortunate, but one of the biggest sporting announcements I had ever heard in my life. So let's take you back 18 years.
Good evening. The former world motor racing champion Ayrton Senna has been pronounced clinically dead after a crash at this afternoon's San Marino Grand Prix.
Well, there we go. I think that unfortunately says it all. Predicted by Senna himself to be a season of lots of accidents. That weekend was one of the darkest weekend, and I don't say that lightly. Started off Rubens Barrichello, Gary. I mean, the photograph, he was in the Jordan, the car actually took off, went into the railing, injured himself. Then, of course, and lest we never forget, Roland Ratzenberger, unfortunately having an accident also around Imola, dying on the Saturday. And then Senna, and right at the beginning of the show, guys, we spoke about why did it have to happen to Senna? Why did it have to happen to Jim Clark? You always ask these millions of questions. But it was amazing how different. You know, Gary, as a racing driver, you have a systematic ritual or routine you go through before you go to a race, before you get into your car. You may put your left glove on first. Senna did everything completely opposite to what he had done in the previous 140-odd races.
Yeah, it's such a hard one to explain. I mean, those are questions we just cannot answer, why it was the case. But, the fact of the matter is that, Senna was obviously very interested as to what happened to Roland Ratzenberger, went out there, obviously very involved with Rubens Barrichello, fellow Brazilian, after his massive accident. And, it was something that Senna was concerned about. As I say, as to exactly what was going on in his head, we'll never ever know. It was a freak accident that killed him, unfortunately. But you've got to say that after that weekend, it changed motorsport, and I think that was the big thing. After Senna's death, it really shifted the entire world of motorsport into another place. We looked at safety completely differently. We were prepared to take steps and make moves to make cars safer and so forth, track safer. It hadn't happened up until then, Yes, maybe a slight bit here or there, but that was when things really started to happen. I mean, it has become a different sport because of that, and I think that was, this is probably a sad thing to say, but had Barrichello died on the Friday and Ratzenberger was killed on the Saturday, had Senna not been killed on the Sunday, I don't think that those moves would have taken place.
I'm not glad you brought that up, but it is something massively significant. And the fact that when Senna did die, Egmont, and we saw the pictures of the funeral, we had over 1 million people lining the streets of Brazil. No one would have ever expected this. Everyone went, what is this? Formula One had always been great and big and well watched, but not nearly until the death of Ayrton Senna. And in such a sad way, Senna propelled Formula One into the stratosphere.
Yeah,
his death.
Yeah, his death played a big role in that. You're right, Sasha. Just want to pick up on Gary's point there as well. Sid Watkins, the racetrack doctor, he was very good friends with Senna. And he always said that Senna had something that no other racing driver ever had. He had you talked about his spirituality and stuff like that. Senna had that different dimension as a man. And Sid Watkins actually tried to persuade him not to race. And because he wasn't in a good condition, he phoned his girlfriend, Adriane Gelastau. She was back in Faro in Portugal. And he phoned her and said, he cried after Ratzenberger died. And he was very upset about Barrichello as well. Barrichello happened on the Friday and then Ratzenberger on the Saturday, and then Ayrton on the Sunday. And the Michele Alboreto incident in the pits as well.
Correct.
Where the tyre just came loose and hit the mechanic.
And then, of course, the start. Let's not forget the start.
Yes,
it was JJ
Leto and Pedro Lamy.
The wheel went into the
Pedro Lamy going into JJ Leto's back. But Senna didn't want to race. or he was not really in a good mind frame. Let's put it that way. And Sid Watkins tried to persuade him, and he just said, there's some things that you can't. Sid actually suggested that he quit racing altogether and they go fishing.
Yeah,
and
I
he said there's
remember
some things that I just can't do. I have to carry on. And I'm pretty sure he was gunning for the world title. I mean, the Williams just come off 2 very strong seasons, and he was favourite to win the title that year. But interesting enough, Senna always said that when he gets to 5 titles, he'll stop, out of respect for Fangio. He will never go on and beat Fangio's record. Whether he would have done is a different story. I don't know. You know, when you're in the game, maybe you think, well, okay, I've got the chance, I'll go on. But that was never to be.
Yeah, unfortunately it wasn't. Vic, we look at the documentary that came out last year on Senna. And I mean, I've watched everything that's come out in English. Since the passing of Senna. There's a lot of other Portuguese ones that I haven't, but I've tried to get as much information as well. And yes, it's a spectacular documentary. I think it documents his life and the way that he comes through the ranks and racing in Europe and then eventually into Formula One. But the one thing that I didn't quite get was how negative they portrayed Alain Prost. I'm not trying to defend Prost, but Prost and Senna made peace. I remember in the 93 season in one of the qualifying laps, Prost was doing a commentary for French television. And Senna was on actually the radio in the car saying, my good friend Alain Prost, we miss you.
That was the race where he died.
That's where he
that
died.
was Imola.
It was Imola. It was actually Monza. I mean, Imola. It was San Marino.
That was coming out of the last chicane onto the
start-finish. Incredibly, they had made peace with each other, yet the documentary somehow just puts, and I think Alain Prost can be a quite difficult man, but if you sit there and think and you look at what they did together, somehow it's sort of like Senna, 10 and Prost 3.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, Prost wasn't portrayed in the best light in that documentary for sure, And I think it all precipitated from all those accidents that happened between Senna and Prost, especially the 89 accident, the 1990 accident into Turn 1, and that Prost immediately was into the offices of Jean-Marie Balestre. Maybe there was a French thing going on there that they basically supported each other very well. And, also remember, Prost was the man in charge when Ayrton Senna joined the McLaren team, and once Senna started to dominate, Prost felt basically kicked out of his own home, unfortunately. And, I don't think Prost was portrayed 100% correctly. I think there's 2 sides to every story. But at the end of the day, Ayrton Senna did have some altercations with him. Alain Prost did, as we did say, turn in very early into those chicanes, put himself in those situations. So, unfortunately, in this situation, Ayrton Senna can't come out and say, that he's forgiven Alain Prost.
Formula One, we always say backwards is if. If Senna had lived, if, you can do it a million times. And might as well just end it there. Unfortunately, it happened. He died back in 1994. But it's amazing, Gary, how his spirit lives on, how his legend lives on. So much more, unfortunately, than a lot of other racing drivers who died.
Yes, it does. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, at the time I was not a Senna fan because of the way that he was portrayed to us as Formula One fans at that point in my life. But, to be able to go and sit down and just, for me, as a racing driver, to go and look at some of the onboard shots of Ayrton Senna and you just look at the way the man drove that car. I mean, I'm sitting here and the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. It's unbelievable. And, as a driver, you try and do things. You try and drive the car as fast as you can. But he was he was able to do things that you cannot comprehend. And for me, that is the amazing thing. And it's always like that in life. You don't appreciate it at the time that it's happening. But when you stand back, reflect, and have another look at it, you just stand back and you're in absolute awe of it.
Yeah.
I think also as well, Sasha, a lot of people who've watched this documentary weren't alive at the time when Ayrton Senna was around. My son, 16 years old, has watched the movie, I think, 5 or 6 times, and he's now an Ayrton Senna fan. He's absolutely loves Formula One, and you've got to say that
that's good. That's fantastic.
Senna has done so much for Formula One, dead and alive, and at the end of the day, you just got to say thank you, Ayrton Senna.
I just want to come back to what Gary said, the way that Senna was portrayed by the media. We have to remember, and I take issue with your viewpoint here, Sasha. Yeah. I think Prost was the culprit. Even in those years, I could see it because I followed Formula One quite closely.
Sure.
But the way Gary made a very good point. The way Senna was portrayed, and we have to remember that Prost was the ultimate political animal. Not only did he play a good political game with his team and with Balest, he played a fantastic political game with the press as well. Prost had this ability to swing the press in his favour.
Good point.
Where Senna was concerned about the truth, Prost would always try and put a spin on it that would favour him. And in that sense, the movie, I think, exposes the political animal behind all of those actions in those years. And I think Prost did play a very, very mean, dirty political game.
No, I think, listen, I couldn't agree with you more there on his ability to manipulate. And I think specifically because Balestre was French, he was French, he had Renault power, etc., etc. You look at all of the various attributes that were in his favour. Everything was worked for Prost.
Yeah. And remember, Sasha, just sorry to interrupt, that in this movie they're not. The movie is not built around a script.
No, of course not.
It's real life situations. It's real life actions and the things that people said at the time. It's you might say that maybe it was manipulated a little bit in the sense that they only showed the good parts of Senna and the bad parts of Prost. But it wasn't a commentary, a script trying to run Prost down.
No. I'm not taking that angle at all. I'm just sitting and saying
it was putting the events together in a filmic sequence.
Yeah.
And if that is what you experience, I think the film succeeded in portraying the realities of the time.
No, I couldn't.
Quite accurately.
Yeah, listen, I think the way that it was, Senna will always be missed. That's the unfortunate tragedy about it. And we'll always sit and question what happened. Why did it happen? How it, why couldn't he have stayed alive?
Sorry, I don't know how much time we've got left.
No, we've got time.
The thing that I want to get in here before we run out of time is you say that's the one thing about the movie that you didn't like quite that much. The thing that I missed in the movie was the first lap at Donington, 94.
Mm-hmm. 93.
93, sorry.
Yeah.
94, he was
unfortunately
already in a different place. First lap, Donington, 93. I mean, he qualified fourth. The two Williamses were just way out. Schumacher had the works Ford engine in the Benetton. And Senna qualified fourth. Off the line, he was actually had a slightly better start than Schumacher, and Schumacher pushed him a little bit off track. Yeah. And he dropped back, and so he entered Redgate fifth. Out of Redgate, he took Schumacher on the inside line. Then he went past Wendlinger. I don't know if you guys ever been to the Craner Curves.
No.
At Donington. I went there one year and I stood there in the rain, in the drizzle, pretty much the same as on that day, except that, on that day it was raining a little bit harder in 93. And it was Easter weekend, by the way, that race. And then he took Wendlinger.
On the outside.
On the outside.
Yeah, I thought he was going to go off the track.
I remember jumping up. I literally jumped up and I was shouting at the TV screen. And I was shouting, "What the hell do you think you're doing, you fool?" And he made it, of course. And then he took a hill, up the hill.
That's it.
And then he took Prost in the second last hairpin.
Yeah, it was incredible.
So it's never been done in Formula One ever, before or after, that the guy who's fifth into the first corner is first at the end of the first lap. It's never been done. And it was mesmerizing. I mean, it was transcendental, it was godly.
No, it is. I mean, listen, that'll always be brought up. 93 Donington, European Grand Prix, Senna, that's how it is. Which is actually great to sort of end this all off. That is your most probably best memory of Senna in terms of racing.
And that wasn't in the movie. So, Vic, you must get that and show that to your son. And if you think he's a Senna fan now.
Yeah. Gary, a favourite memory of Senna? And I know it's difficult to lead one, but I mean, that's one of them, surely. Another one you got?
I think, look, his first Grand Prix win in Estoril. I mean, it was a sublime performance. I mean, just outdrove anybody by miles that day, everybody by miles. You knew right then and there that Senna he'd arrived at that point. That was when it was like, well, yes, we know he was quick, but Senna has now arrived. And, and that was the beginning of an era in Formula One. It was absolutely fantastic. So, anybody what was there. I've spoken to a couple of people that were at the event, and those people were also Senna fans for life after watching that performance. It was a great era.
Yeah, the gold and black Lotus as well. Vic, any something very, very special?
Yeah, the same lap that we spoke about now, 93 Donington. But I think also, any one of those 65 qualifying pole position laps on the onboard cameras, going through the streets of the Principality in Brazil, in Suzuka, the amazing way you can control the car, heel and toe. Remember, there was no auto blip. There was nothing of those electronic aids, sequential gearboxes, one hand on the steering wheel. It's just amazing, sublime stuff that I'm not so sure we'll see in the near future.
Yeah, John Watson tells a story. By the way, I once asked John Watson at Kyalami, who was the three best Formula 1 drivers ever up to this point. It's a couple of years ago. And he said, well, that's simple. Senna, and Senna. But he was in 96 he got caught by Senna at Dingle Dell.
Yeah.
And he said, as Senna entered Dingle Dell, he pulled over and he saw this golden black Lotus flashing by, and he just had a glimpse of what was happening in the cockpit. And his days of keeping the turbo boost up and all of that, and changing gears, and he said it was a blur of hands and sound and keeping the. And at the end of that lap, he went into the pits and he walked up to the Lotus pits and he said to Peter Waugh, the team manager, and the mechanics, he walked in and he said, I just saw, and they all went, I just saw something, and they all went, we know, don't calm down, we know.
Incredible stuff. I mean, we could talk all day about Senna. Just want to let you know from the Gearz page on who is or was the greatest in our poll that we've been running here. Was it Fangio, Senna, Schumacher, Prost, Clark? Anybody has it a guess who's topping it?
Well, it depends on the age of the people voting,
They're all about your age.
It's got to be Senna then.
Well, it's amazing. Schumacher 36% and Senna 34%.
No, they're wrong, I mean, it's as simple as that. If
everyone says you're wrong, that's it. You're wrong.
If you go back to Formula One Racing Magazine, they've had polls every 5 years for the last how many years. And they asked like 220, 250 ex-racing drivers and team managers to vote. And Senna's won it all.
Yeah,
every single year.
He's always up there.
Yeah.
Guys, listen, terrific to have you in here. And I'm sure we'll do it again next year on the 19th anniversary, unfortunately, of the passing of Ayrton Senna. But great to get your insights. And also, for those who've never seen anything on Senna, do yourself a favor. Get as much as you can. Go and read up on what was one of the greatest ever racing drivers, I think, to be on earth. So, Egmont, great to have your insights. Really appreciate your time. It's great to have you. Gary, Vic, always. I mean, we discuss this every other week in studio, but it's great to have your opinions and insights on Senna as well. We'll definitely make sure that this is available so that you can go and listen to it again.
At the next intersection, turn on Gearz with Sasha Martinengo. Weekdays from 12 to 2 p.m. Central African Time on bulls.co.za.